What's up, guys? It's your boy Ghouls here. I'm gonna take you guys through this this little Ableton rack I made. It's pretty much a random bass generator. What it does is it takes all of these different serum patches that I have on all these different layers, and with a click of a button, it creates a completely new, novel bass sound. And yeah, I think it would be really useful to show you guys how this works. So yeah, let's get into it. First thing I want to do is show you some of the sounds that this rack is capable of generating. And I think in one day I resampled out I think there's like 250 or 300 bass sounds. And that's the reason I wanted to make this video, is to show that I think it makes more sense to do something like this than to spend all day focusing on like recreating one sound or creating one sound, because efficiency wise I can do something like this and end up with a slew of samples that I can save off to a folder that all sound pretty decent and usable, and then I can just get right to making a track. And anytime I want to make a new track, I can open up this rack and then make a whole bunch of new sounds very easily. So yeah, I'll just show you some of the sounds, the variety that this thing can generate. I'll just solo this track. It can make some pretty brutal sounds. So you get the idea. And this video isn't so much about showing you how to make this type of a sound, these types of sounds, but it's more or less just showing how this works. And you could do this with any other type of sound. I mean, you could do this with, bass sounds, lead sounds, pads, or anything in general, really. So now that you've seen those examples, I'll jump into the rack. The rack is made up of 5 layers, and each one of those layers has a serum, and then that's contained within a separate rack of its own. And these macros in Ableton are controlling different things in Serum, and then the main rack, that is the randomization rack, is controlling those macros. So the macros in Serum, the most important thing to know is that I'm trying to save these macros for controlling these control points in the main LFO that's driving the sound. And the reason for that is because the Ableton macros, as far as I know, can't control those yet. I don't know if Steve Duda is working on that. That would be great. But for right now, the majority of what you're hearing the variation come from is from manipulating these control points with these macros, which control these macros. And if you want to control something else, like something like a control cutoff, and then in here, I think I'm with one of these knobs, I'm manipulating this reverb filter here, the cutoff of that. If you can control these with the Ableton macros, I would recommend doing that, only because you can't manipulate these. I think they're called LFO buses. If I go into the matrix here, you can see, macro 3 LFO bus 3, macro 1 LFO bus 2. You can't control those with the Ableton macros. So I'll let you look at this patch, and if you want to copy it, you can do that. Okay, so here's the main LFO, and you can see what that's manipulating. And this LFO, if I change the macro that's controlling those, you can hear the variation is absolutely coming from manipulating that LFO. Okay, so you can see what that's controlling in here, and then I'll show you this LFO2, and all that's doing really is controlling the amplitude envelope of the noise oscillator. I'm using the sampler in the noise oscillator. It's not on one-shot mode, and the reason for that is because I have this control point assigned to a macro down here. Well, first it's a macro here, and then it's controlled by a macro here, which is then controlled by another macro here. So it's like 3 stages of macros in a chain, like an inception type of thing. And so it's not on one-shot mode, and the reason for that is if I want the sample to repeat and get some really cool stuttering effects, I can just change this. So you hear that little tail that it's adding. It's because it's allowing that sample to play longer, repeat longer, and the repeats are dependent upon where this pitch knob is set. The higher the pitch, the more times it will repeat. The slower the pitch, the less times it will repeat. And you can get the one-shot effect by just changing the length of this LFO here. And then if you change the pitch, you can change that stuttering effect, which is really cool. It allows for a lot of really interesting variations. Okay, so that's the main page, and then here's this LFO, and all this, the sound is mostly being driven by the effects and what this LFO is doing to these effects. So you can copy all this stuff if you want. I've got distortion and EQ, with a little bit of modulation on the EQ, modulating the mix on the chorus, the cutoff on the reverb filter, and a little bit of the hyper, and that's about it. Now an important thing to mention about the modulation on these, because we're going to be hitting this random button, you really kind of want to make sure that you make these ranges, like everywhere that these knobs, the macros in Ableton, everywhere that they're being applied, you want them to be useful across their entire range, because you don't want to hit the random button and get something really unwieldy that's not so useful. Now it's kind of hard to avoid all of that because you're shooting for variation, but you have to do that within reason. So yeah, that's what's going on with the main patch, and I'll just solo that so you can hear that. So that's the main patch, and there's really not much processing on it. I think I have high pass filter to cut out the lows. And I do have a Serum effects on here, and the reason I have that on here is because I can create a whole other level of variation through that, and I could make another 20 macros for that, but what I'm doing right now is I'm just turning it on, and you can hear what it's doing to the sound. So you could have a bunch of these Serum effects set up, and then just turn them on and off to create like a completely different variety of the same sound. And I'll open that up and you can take a look at what that's doing. It's just an LFO being applied to all of these effects. You could pause the video if you wanted to copy any of this stuff. Alright, and now I have a bass layer. In the bass layer, the same thing's happening. I'm just manipulating these control points on the LFO, and that allows me to change the amp envelope, the shape of the amp envelope, and then the shape of the pitch envelope, so I can create quite a wide variety of sub sounds. I can shorten it up. I can change the pitching. With this knob all the way down, it's not really applying any pitch modulation. So it covers a couple octaves, and sometimes it ends up in this higher register, and that it's not so useful. I probably should change that. The way that's doing that, I could just change the ranges in here on this master tune. I think it's set to 24. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's just an amp envelope and a pitch envelope, using the same concept of mapping these LFO buses to these macros, and then to these macros, and then to these macros. Alright, and then I have this clicky punchy thing. That's another serum patch, and this one, really no involvement into the randomization. There's no macros or anything. This is the same for all those sounds that I showed you. It just adds a little bit of a punchy beginning to the sounds, and sometimes I'll turn down the volume of that chain just so the sound isn't so aggressive at the beginning. Some of the sounds don't really lend themselves to that, so I'll just manually turn that down. And yeah, just a little bit of distortion and OTT on that. And then processing for that layer is I've got this snap heap preset made by Nasko. If you sign up for his Patreon, you can get this. And what this does is it essentially it clips the highs and then limits the lows. And the reason for that is you don't want to destroy your sub-frequency waveforms. Now, I'm doing that for this clicky layer and the transient layer just to tame the transient. But I do have that rack on the end of my overall chain, which is applied to the entire rack. And that's important because you don't want to clip your subs, and the sub is running through this. So like if you let me see here, if I show you any one of these resampled basses, you'll see that the waveform of the sub, which is this main zigzaggy line, it's a triangle wave, which I'm using for the sub, it never clips off the top. It's always just squished into the window. And that's important because if you've ever seen a sub clip, it squarifies the top of it and you get nasty distortion, and you don't want that. So it's only clipping these little fuzzy things on the overall waveform. So yeah, and then on the overall chain, I'm applying a little bit of glue to glue all those layers together, some soothe to tame some high frequencies, the harsh high frequencies, or upper mids, I guess I should say. And then, yeah, the clipping and the limiting. So then I have the transient layer. That is just the noise oscillator on one-shot mode. That's it. There's nothing going on there special. That's not involved in any of the randomization. Then I have this layer, which is a variation of the main layer, and I think it's not much different. I mean, it's a little simpler, a little more stripped down. I'm not even using oscillators because it doesn't really matter so much. Because like I said, all of the processing, all the sound that you're hearing is coming from these FX processes. So yeah, it's running through the filter. So I have the little N here, which stands for noise. I had that clicked on, and it's not going direct out. So like I said, it's running through all this stuff. Yeah, and that's the majority of it all. Yeah, it's the other thing that I should say is you could lock any one of these, so that way when you hit the random button they don't move, and I found that useful in certain situations. Like say you find like a sound when you hit the random button that you really like, and then you find that just moving one of the knobs creates some really cool novel variations. You can lock all the other macros so they're not involved in the randomization. If I show you this one example here, I have I named it growl because I hit the random button and it sounded really growly and cool, but I noticed that if I just moved the reverb filter, I got a lot of really cool sounds out of it, and they all sounded kind of similar, so I wanted to make a bunch of those just to save them for later. So you can hear at the end there's like a really cool growly sound, but if I move this reverb filter, there's a lot of cool stuff going on in like this range of that macro. So something else you could do is you could automate just that macro, and if I just pull that up, it creates a completely different sound because now it's turning that knob. So all the sounds that I showed you earlier that I created using that other rack, I wasn't automating anything with with the automation lanes. That was all happening inside the patch. But you could easily do that and come up with a ton of other variations just by moving these around. So yeah, that was something worth mentioning. You can lock the macros and just play with one of the macros. If everything else sounds really cool, you can just do that. And I'm trying to think if I missed anything else. Oh yeah, that layer right here. I think I didn't show anything about this processing. The only thing I'm doing here is I have the only thing different is I have a bit crusher on it. So if I solo that, it just adds a little bit of crunchiness, which I like to hear in the background a little bit. It's a very low level sound. You probably couldn't even hear it if unless you were really focusing. But it's got a little bit of an effect. And then I think I'm limiting it. It's not even touching the limiter, so yeah, that's just about it. If you guys have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out, leave a comment, and if I missed anything, I'll get back to you, or maybe I'll have to make a short little video explaining something else. But otherwise, yeah, I hope this helped you guys out, and go to it, do it up. Peace.